Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast today. We're going to take a narrative approach to the events in World War II. This will be the first half of that story up to the beginning of 1942. Regardless of where you might place the beginning of World War II, most historians place it with the invasion of Poland and the declaration of war by the British and the French on Germany. Immediately after that, though, the next move for Hitler is to invade Scandinavia. He takes Denmark, Sweden, and Norway relatively quickly, relatively easy. And the reason that he does this is because of a new technique, a new way of having war called the Blitzkrieg, which in German means lightning war. This was a technique that he had sort of experimented with during the Spanish Civil War earlier, and by the time of the invasion of Poland, had more or less perfected, and it works pretty darn efficiently. How does it work? Well, the first step is he sends in Air Force bombers. The Luftwaffe is the Air Force for the Nazi army. They go in first and just bomb the crap out of everything, especially hitting military targets at that particular time, sort of softening everything up. The next stage then is heavy artillery, especially tanks. Tanks, as we'll see, are like ubiquitous throughout, especially the war in Europe. They go in relatively, free of worry because it's already been bombed by the planes, taking down anything else that's left. And then finally, the infantry moves in as a sort of mop up situation. The foot soldiers come in to take care of any resistance that remains. So it's a very quick, very, very efficient technique of battle, very different from what we saw in World War I. From there, then, Hitler moves his focus to the west. And so he takes Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg relatively easily. Um, and if you remember, this is starting to look like the idea, the plan that they had, the Schlieffen Plan in World War I. Once they've got those, they then turn their attention to France. So how is this different and how is this similar to what the Schlieffen Plan was? Well, the path is obviously very similar, especially going through Belgium to get to France. Of course, what's different though is, first of all, Hitler is not that concerned at this point about having to fight a war on two fronts because he's got this anti-aggression agreement with the Soviet Union at the time. Moreover, though, this blitzkrieg technique is sort of ensuring that there isn't trench warfare and he's not going to get bogged down the way the Germans had in World War I. In the end, they very efficiently take over France and set up what's another example of a puppet state known as Vichy France, a puppet state again where a foreign power installs a leader whom they control. So, in effect, it's technically still France, but it's controlled by Germany. The next step for Hitler then is to move his attention north. And he has a plan to invade Great Britain, which he calls Operation Sea Lion. This is his plan using this blitzkrieg technique to actually take Great Britain and the British Isles as a whole. However, there's a flaw with this, and the flaw is he underestimates the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, which is able to both counter the Luftwaffe in the air much more efficiently than anybody had before, but is also actually able to take the attack to Berlin, and they actually start dropping bombs on Berlin even as the Germans are dropping bombs on Britain. So the original plan is sort of foiled a little bit, and so Hitler then changes his approach. He's no longer focusing on military targets. His plan now is he's just going to bomb the crap out of London. the obviously most densely populated place in England, in all of the British Isles, and just forced them into submission. It's no longer about military targets, it's just civilian targets until they submit. The British hold out, however, and the whole plan just sort of stalls. It doesn't work the way he thought. It's not going to happen. He's not going to be able to capture Britain, so he's got to have a plan B. And as we'll see in just a moment, he does in fact have a plan B. However, while things aren't working so well for his intent to move northward, excuse me, on the south, things are a little bit different. First of all, Italy invades Greece from its position in Albania, but it's not so successful there until the Germans send in support troops. And with that, then the Axis powers, the Rome-Berlin axis, takes not only Greece but Yugoslavia. It's at that point that Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania join the Axis powers. The extent to which they really wanted to, or they simply were, they saw the writing on the wall that they were going to be conquered, is debatable. Nonetheless, that is what's happening in the Balkans area in southern Europe. But even more to the south, in North Africa, a German general, Rommel, who's known as the Desert Fox from fighting these tank battles in the deserts of North Africa, is expanding the Axis territories. So let's talk for a moment about what's going on in North Africa. On this particular map, well, first of all, remember that Germany lost all of its colonial possessions in Africa after World War I. That was part of the Treaty of Versailles, that they had to give all of those up. So they had no African colonies. Italy, however, did, which is in gold in this particular image. But they're surrounded to the west by French colonial possessions and British to the east in Egypt. And so Rommel is basically expanding the Axis territories because Italy is not in a position to do it themselves. And it kind of is a kind of prelude to what's going to happen later in the war. The Germans are really sort of acting as the daddy for Italy in many cases. Italy's not able to finish the job, and Germany is the one who's really actually getting the results. Now, having sort of, established his position in Western Europe, Hitler then moves east and decides to attack the Soviet Union in what he calls Operation Barbarossa. Now, he's not able to invade Great Britain, so he's got to expand his territory. All right. Even though he has an agreement with Stalin, the non-aggression pact, that they're not going to attack each other for 10 years, it was all a ruse to him. It was nothing more than to ensure that he didn't have a two-front war. So what's going on here? Well, part of this is fueled by his idea of Lebensraum, the living space, that his great empire had to have more territory, especially the territory in Eastern Europe, which was particularly good for growing wheat. From Stalin's perspective, though, Stalin really thought this was a deal, and he was kind of caught off guard by this. His focus is on his 5-year plans to bring the Soviet Union to a position of global dominance in terms of industrialization. So the Soviets are kind of caught off guard by this. Now, what are the consequences of this decision? Well, it turns out it was a pretty fateful decision that Hitler makes here. First of all, if you notice on the map, the invasion begins in June, and very quickly the Germans are able to take a lot of territory in Eastern Europe. And so by the time winter rolls around, this dotted line right here is the front line where the Germans had advanced, but then it's winter. Napoleon very famously could not invade Russia because of the winter, and yet here is Hitler, a typically rather astute student of history, making the same mistake. And so while he expands his territory, he's not able to capture the three main cities that he intends before winter sets in and they get bogged down. But I would argue the bigger consequence is that the Soviet Union is now sucked into the war. They are now a legitimate enemy, and this is going to parallel something that's going on in the Pacific, as we'll see in just a moment. So let's turn our attention then to what's going on with Japan. First of all, Japan originally, in the idea they had of this East Asian new order, Japan was really mostly interested in expanding its territory into the Soviet Union. But when Hitler and Stalin signed this non-aggression pact, they're kind of like stuck because they're allied with Germany, and Germany agreed they weren't going to attack Soviet Union, so by extension Japan can't. But they definitely are interested in expanding their imperial holdings. So the next target becomes Southeast Asia. Now, if you notice something though, look at the territory and who controls it. French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, those are relatively easy targets insofar as France and Holland are both controlled by Germany. There's not going to be much of an offense there. Burma and Malaya, which are controlled by Great Britain, Britain is under heavy attack, getting bombarded in London by the attempted invasion there. So, what is their justification for doing this? Well, what the Japanese are telling people is this is anti-Western liberation. We are freeing these people from dominance by Europeans. Okay, well, there maybe you could kind of see why they'd say that, but then remember Thailand, which at the time was Siam, was actually an independent kingdom. It had resisted colonization by both the French and the British. It wasn't actually a colony of anybody. So what is really going on here is they've sort of shifted this new order idea away from just East Asia to what they now call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Like the Greater East Asia, it's going to be larger than they originally intended, but that co-prosperity sphere, that sort of gives you an indication of where their propaganda lies. Like we're creating this space where, yeah, Japanese are going to be sort of in control, but it's good for all of you, and besides that, you're not going to be controlled by the Europeans. All of that goes relatively well, although as we'll see, there is some pretty stiff resistance from the British territories for reasons that have nothing to do specifically with the British, but we'll get to that later on. But the big issue becomes the Philippines, which is controlled by the United States. And so, whereas most of the Western European countries are not in a position to do much about it, the United States is. However, their policy all along has kind of been similar to the isolationism that preceded World War One. And so there's a reluctance to get in there. And that reluctance, if you remember, I mentioned this in class, is sort of codified in what become known as the Neutrality Acts. These acts of Congress that are sort of designed to maintain a U.S. position of neutrality as a way to not get sucked into this war as they had in the First World War. However, President Roosevelt believes that the United States should be involved, and he actually makes an agreement with the British to trade destroyers for British bases throughout the Western Hemisphere, particularly in South America. And so there's this kind of underhanded secret support of at least the British that's going on. But that all becomes codified in what becomes known as the Lend-Lease Act. This is an act of Congress that gives the president the power to negotiate lending, leasing, or even selling any sort of support that is deemed in the best interest of the United States. And so now the pretense of neutrality is kind of gone. They're providing arms, especially to the Allied powers, although they're technically not involved. Now, as an aside, that doesn't have a direct effect on the narrative that I'm telling right now, but something we'll come back to later. Roosevelt also had a secret meeting with Churchill on a ship in the Atlantic during this time, where they basically set up a charter for what's going to happen to the world after World War II. And there's two aspects of this. One is that idea of self-determination. You might recall that Wilson, in his idea of the League of Nations, that was a big point for him, but that didn't really apply the way he thought it would. But Roosevelt was pretty adamant, especially in the places that were taken over by the Nazis and also, as we'll see later on, by the Soviets, that they should determine what their fate would be themselves. But it also becomes the bedrock for what will become the United States. As we've seen, the League of Nations, despite its best intentions, doesn't have the teeth to actually, do what it's supposed to do. So the sort of foundation for what will become the United Nations is laid in that meeting. And again, doesn't have a direct effect on our narrative right now, but it's something that we'll come back to later on. For our most immediate purposes, though, is Congress passes a series of laws called the Embargo Act. So what's going on here? Well, when the Japanese are expanding their territory throughout Southeast Asia, and especially the Philippines, which the United States control, the United States decides the only leverage they have at that point is economic. And so the embargo is they're going to stop selling particularly oil and iron, which the Japanese would use to make steel, the sort of raw ingredients for the Japanese industrial machine. They're going to just stop selling it to them. Japan, despite its attempt to sort of extricate itself from the global economy, is still really heavily dependent on those two natural resources of the United States. And so the idea is the United States is basically going to force Japan to make some sort of change. Of course, Japan has a very different idea. They view this as an attack on their sovereignty and their imperial ambitions. And so the fateful day of December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, Japan decides that it's going to attack the U.S. naval facilities at Pearl Harbor. Now, what are they thinking? They genuinely believed that this would force the United States to renegotiate, and that the United States would had no interest in going into the war, and they would just sort of, open back up and sort of stay out of the way. They thought this was a way to get leverage. Of course, the biggest consequence of that, though, is just as Hitler miscalculates in invading the Soviet Union, Japan miscalculates the United States response. And so the United States declares war on Japan, but not only on Japan, also on Germany. So now the big consequence is that the United States is now involved in this. So here's the situation then as we move into the beginning of 1942. In terms of the Axis powers, we've got those three that have sort of been at the heart of this all along: Germany, Japan, and Italy. Obviously, it's looking more and more like Germany is really running the show in Europe. But now the ally situation is very, very different. Great Britain obviously is still at its heart. Remember, France is still, the Vichy government is in control. They're essentially a puppet state of Germany. But now, after these events in 1941, the Soviet Union and the United States are now in this war. And so the stage is set then for the events of 1942, which I will present tomorrow in the next next chapter of the story. Excuse me. The tide's going to turn, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Now that the Allies have sort of repositioned themselves, and the big three is established. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys in class.